it's hard actually to follow, even if it's a little bit later after Michael Smith, because not only did he touch on a couple of the points that I'll be going into more depth in, but he did a much better flowery greeting than I will ever be able to do. So I just wish to say to everyone, Annyeonghaseyo. I have apologies for my horrible pronunciation. I want to particularly thank the Korea Daily for this opportunity and to thank all of you. And I promise that I will try to do my best to not speak too quickly and to make sure that as I go through the economics of the U.S.-South Korea relationship, I'll talk a little bit about the background and exactly why things are particularly important now, particularly not only for the U.S. and South Korea, but in particular for South Korea in relationship to Southern California. One of the most important things that has happened for all of us to know about is that there has been a dramatic transformation over the last 15 years in improvements in the trade relationship between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea. We've seen a 117% increase in that trade relationship. And it's worth noting that most of this happened in advance to KORUS, the U.S.-South Korea Free Trade Agreement, that was only implemented in 2012, even if the agreement itself was actually largely worked out 4 to 5 years before that. It's a relationship that has been very broad. If you look at it, we have a situation where it's $167 billion in goods and services. This is a relationship that is incredibly deep. Korea is the 6th largest goods trading partner for the United States. We actually do have a goods trade deficit between the U.S. and South Korea. That's one of the reasons that actually prompted the renegotiations under the Trump administration, was to try and address some of those imbalances. But it's worth noting, on the other hand, that the U.S. has a $12 billion surplus in services between itself and Korea. For those of you who are very aware of trade negotiations and politics in Washington, you'll know that the Trump administration tends to focus a lot more on goods than services. When the president pointed out that there was a trade deficit between the United States and Canada, the Canadians noted, well, it was a goods deficit, but the U.S. surplus in services was so large that in fact the Canadians were running a deficit to the United States. The U.S. was exporting more to Canada than it was importing. That being said, one of the things that's incredibly important to understand now is that this U.S.-Korea relationship, especially given the fact that the Trans-Pacific Partnership went forward without the United States, that the U.S. put its relationship on hold in favor of ongoing bilateral negotiations, has meant that Korea has been better positioned both in terms of direct access for Americans to Korea and Koreans to America, but more importantly is the ongoing relationship in the supply chain. Fundamentally, even though there's a limit in some ways in terms of what imports and exports are directly tied into us here in Southern California, what is incredibly important is just how much the consumer electronics, various aerospace, defense, various specialized manufacturing components, agriculture and otherwise, all are tied into a relationship that involves the U.S. and Korea, and oftentimes, because of the existing North American Free Trade Agreement, Mexico and Canada as well. That allows for a much more robust relationship. It allows for a situation where we are able to see such a tremendous expansion, such as the fact that U.S. exports to Korea from before the Free Trade Agreement till now have gone up nearly 30%, and they account, with Korea being our 6th largest destination, they account for 3.4% of U.S. exports overall. One of the things to keep in mind is that U.S. exports to Korea do not particularly tie in California as well. Particularly when we talk about mineral fuels as being a major factor, that really means oil and oil-related products. But that being said, it's worth noting that even California is particularly tied into the energy industry. And then when you look at other categories such as machinery, electrical machinery, and optical and medical instruments and aircraft, California is very heavily tied into that relationship, as I'll talk later. And when we talk about $8.4 billion in agricultural exports, that makes Korea our 5th largest agricultural export market, and the revised free trade agreement only expands on that. It is wonderful to be in a place as we are now, where you can actually find Korean specialty goods on the shelves here in Los Angeles, which I will say this, you can't always find in other parts of the country. But it is also wonderful to know that the inverse is true. In California in particular, as being a center of a number of specialty food products, is particularly well positioned to benefit from that broader relationship. Exports to services also have increased, and quite honestly, the increase from 2008 to 2018 was nearly an 80% jump in services. As we move increasingly to a digital economy, to a non-manufacturing focused economy, services will continue to be greater and greater in that relationship, as the banks in this room, I'm sure, can attest. If you actually look at the exports and the export relationship, as I said, oil and machinery in particularly show up, including parts for semiconductor manufacturing. As I said, we are dealing with the fact that there are a couple issues here that especially show up and were particularly important in the last trade negotiations. And that's in terms of, if you look at the motor vehicle relationship, where motor vehicles come in 6 at $1.25 billion, the Trump administration made a point of pushing the fact that they wanted to see U.S. vehicle exports to Korea to double, ideally under the revised trade agreement. The catch is, and one of the important things to understand about that relationship, is that the U.S. automakers in particular have built the Korean, not only automakers themselves, but part suppliers into the inherent relationship of U.S. automobiles. This has gone on for decades, and one of the things that particularly solidified this is that during the Asian financial crisis in the late 1990s, when Korean auto manufacturing expanded faster than there was actually a market for it, there was a retrenchment, particularly where Hyundai wound up in the dominant position. But one of the key auto players at the time, Daewoo, who had already been supplying General Motors with vehicles, for those of you who have ever seen any of the particularly small Chevy cars, those are generally made in Korea. But Daewoo wound up being acquired by GM. And in fact, to this day, you have a huge linkage between GM's manufacturing in Korea and not only the US market, but also their overall global supply chain. The fact that Hyundai has grown in leaps and bounds in the US market as well, that they have expanded in terms of their presence not only in the US but in Canada and Mexico, is only to increase that relationship. You've also increasingly seen Korean companies tied in, when we talk about aerospace, the fact that they've been particularly tied in as key providers of technologies in aerospace, key providers in cell phones. Just as an example, for those of you who are not aware, Apple has spent years trying to disentangle itself from Samsung as a conglomerate, because Samsung is their main high-value rival in cell phones. Unfortunately for Apple, Samsung still makes key components that Apple can't live without, which has meant that the two companies remain tied together. But it also more broadly reflects the fact that Korean companies have managed to position themselves as indispensable in the global supply chain on the high end, including in key areas such as cell phones and others, in a way that many other countries have not. And in many cases, the Koreans have managed to supplant the Japanese as one of the key innovators and suppliers of high-end technologies, particularly in collaboration with the United States. This means that for the US, and especially as trade tensions with China continue to rise, the Korean relationship is increasingly important, not just on the government and economic side, but more importantly for manufacturers and for that broader relationship. If you look at it in terms of imports, Korea is the 6th largest supplier of goods imports. You especially see things, well, as I said, vehicles, $18 billion. So compare that to the slightly over $1 billion going the other way. You can see where the relationship is going. Electrical machinery, yes, even mineral fuels come back the other way. And pharmaceuticals. Agriculture is particularly more in favor of the United States, but there's still $627 million in agriculture coming from Korea in different forms to the United States. And the fact is that whether it's goods, it's services, it's transportation, or otherwise, this is an incredibly robust relationship and one of the best markets for Korean goods, if not the best market for Korean goods outside of Asia. If you look at imports, once again, look at the fact that cell phones come in second. As I said, the Samsung relationship is incredibly important, also LG and others, but it's also components, not just the cell phones themselves. And as I said, motor vehicles, it's not just the vehicles, it's the parts, it's computer parts, it's various other things, computer chips as well. All of these different elements, and we see the electric storage batteries coming down in 10th. That is itself a sign of future collaboration in one of the greatest potential growth areas as the relationship, particularly between the US and Korea, moves into new sectors in terms of clean technologies and renewables. Having energy storage is incredibly important, and given the fact that the primary battery supplier at this point is China, collaboration with Korea is considered increasingly important, not only for existing supplies, but also in terms of future research, which I'll talk about. If you look at the top trading ports between the US and South Korea, you can see that the Port of Los Angeles, San Francisco International Airport, the Port of Long Beach, all show up as being key to that relationship. You may ask yourself why Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport is second. You say they can't exactly fly oil to Korea. And the answer is very simple. It is cell phones. Samsung's US operations are based for telecommunications are based out of Dallas. It is viewed as the key distribution point for, in many cases, Samsung and LG, as well as certain other consumer electronics that are just-in-time deliveries, meaning that they don't get put on a boat and shipped out. If they go on a boat, as you can tell, they largely go to the Port of LA, Port of Houston, Port of Long Beach, and others. That relationship in terms of just-in-time manufacturing, meaning that things that are made, shipped quickly, go to market as quickly as possible, often if they are not just going directly to market or being incorporated into larger scale strategies, is also reflective of the fact that the US-Korea trade relationship continues to modernize and grow. We talked about the goods and trades deficit, that it is $5.8 billion right now. When you compare that to the trade deficit the US is running with a number of other countries, especially certain countries in close proximity to South Korea, this is actually a fairly small number, and the fact is that as this overall economic relationship grows, you will see this deficit rise and fall. California, by the way, in conjunction with this, is in a situation where it is a very robust relationship, even further in some ways proportionately than the national one. Korea is the 5th largest export destination for California. It's one of the top exporting states. And in fact, California exports to Korea have reached nearly $10 billion. Now, that being said, if you look at it, the California trade deficit with Korea with $16.6 billion could be argued to be single-handedly responsible for the trade deficit for the United States and the Republic of Korea, given the fact that it's actually larger than the overall, it's larger in some respects than the overall trade deficit. One of the reasons for this is particular because of the fact that California, being at the center of high technology in many areas of advanced manufacturing as well as consumption of advanced products, is particularly tied into this. The other reason, quite honestly, for California having this trade deficit is simple. Californians have consistently shown a willingness to adopt and purchase new technologies from companies that they view as being more leading edge, more reliable, and of better value. This has helped Korean automakers tremendously to reach the California market. It has also helped with consumer electronics and appliances as well, and this has contributed significantly to that. It also is why California continues to remain incredibly important for Korean companies, because the ability to access and penetrate the United States market is often very heavily tied into the fact that Californian consumers are more willing to take chances on various consumer products. If you look at the fact that when LG once upon a time was still selling things under the Gold Star brand, that California even then was one of the main areas, particularly for the company to reach the US market. South Korean investment in the United States is incredibly important. In fact, South Korean foreign direct investment into the US has continued to grow from $37 billion in 2014, actually about $38 billion in 2014, up to over $57 billion by 2018. As a matter of fact, as South Koreans companies increasingly look at investing in the United States as part of their supply chain, not only to reach the US market, but also to reach other parts of the world, this investment relationship is increasingly important. It supports over 51,000 American jobs. It goes into a number of different sectors. And this itself has led to a situation where multinational investments are all around the country. I've talked a bit about the fact that Texas is incredibly important in terms of Samsung and others. California still remains, in particular, a key location in terms of attracting a wide variety of different investment, and with the largest number of different companies that are receiving that investment, with over 303. But you can see that there is investments in Michigan, particularly in the auto industry, as well as Georgia, in batteries and various others, and that South Korean investments can actually touch almost every state in the United States. This is an incredibly broad relationship. That's one that, as much as we talk about California or even Texas, actually stretches to over 40 different states, and it includes a number of the different key Korean manufacturers and researchers. There are examples, particularly CJ Bio put a facility in Iowa. You can see that Samsung, as I've talked about, particularly not only manufactures, not only operates out of Texas, they in fact manufacture in Texas. And there's a broad relationship here in particular that is incredibly important. Hyundai Motors is not only invested in an Alabama manufacturing facility, it also has manufacturing relationships around the United States. Lotte Chemical has actually, you can see, has also invested a large new plant in Louisiana, as well as having investments throughout other parts of the United States. And this is also incredibly important in terms of research and development. The view that there is a significant amount of research, Samsung's American research base being here in California, in Silicon Valley. You've also seen Hyundai having a significant amount of R&D, particularly based here in Southern California, as well as in the state of Michigan. And that relationship continues to grow. And as I've talked about LG having a broader relationship, they've also done electrical vehicle components, once again batteries in Michigan. SK has built a similar facility in Georgia. These kinds of elements are incredibly important. And the other thing that I want to bring up again is that as the Chinese have had capital control issues, as well as the ongoing trade war between China and the United States and the various consequences thereof, Southern California and the United States have looked to other major investors, particularly in real estate. Chinese investments in real estate, compared to their peak at around 2014, have dropped to below 1/10 annually what they were at that time. And in many ways, this has left an opportunity for South Koreans to actually go in. So if you look at where the 2014 was the peak year for when Chinese were starting up a number of their investments, they peaked in real estate as recently as 2017, and you've seen everything drop off. And even as Hong Kong has also followed suit, where Hong Kong investors often were a channel for Chinese investments as well as companies based there on their own, and that South Korea has continued to stay strong in the opportunities for South Korean investment, not just key properties such as Wilshire Grand downtown, but throughout California and around the U.S. The demand will continue to be there, and one would actually expect this number, which has remained fairly consistent, to actually grow. The South Korea-California connection has involved $2.3 billion of investment since 2003, nearly 8,000 jobs created, 10,000 students, which is also a key part of the relationship, which makes up over 6% of all international students in the state. And it's over $1.3 billion spent by tourists, including 525,000 Korean Americans here in California. This is a tremendous relationship. It is one that is incredibly important, and as I've noted, is that as the U.S.-South Korea relationship continues to grow, we expect the South Korea-California relationship to grow as well. Not simply really in terms of trade. As noted, we are dealing with a trade situation itself where that overall growth may stagnate, especially as economic growth, particularly industrial growth, stagnates. But in terms of the overall foreign direct investment, the number of opportunities, the number of jobs throughout Southern California will continue to grow. And it's worth remembering that no matter what, that California and Californians in particular view the relationship between the U.S. and Korea and Americans and Koreans, not only in terms of jobs and investment, but in terms of culture, in terms of tourism, in terms of the broader engagement, as one that is incredibly valued and is one that we continue to expect as long as economic growth continues to keep growing. And even if economic growth stagnates, the relationship in terms of students, research and development, and other areas will continue to thrive. And for that, I want to say thank you very much to everyone.